Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I should begin by saying, this was such a powerful presentation, and Jeff did a great job as well. And I think if I were in the audience, if I heard the beginning of what I'm about to present, I would think that Zaki and I are in utter disagreement across the board, and we do disagree about some things. But if you look at my PowerPoint presentation, the last part of the subtitle, local control, is really key here. So I'd like to encourage you, to the extent that you're willing, to see how much overlap there is actually in the messages that we have about this. I come at it a bit differently because I spend so much time working for governments, I think. But I'd like to think that we're in violent agreement on some really important points. So you can tell that the topic I want to discuss here is the evolving public and public education. The point I would like to make is that as our evolving systems of public education in urban America changes, adapts, our sense of public changes as well. I don't think it's lesser or greater, but it's different, and that difference is meaningful. And the three things maybe to keep in mind are state authority, parental choice, and then local control. So along those lines, I think that we're in this transitional phase in urban public education delivery. My view is that there's this growing opinion among especially policymakers that our urban districts for too long either can't or just have not got the results that we want for low income, particularly kids of color. And so this has led policymakers, decision makers to go back to what I call first principles. In state constitutions, some of you may not know this, it actually empowers the state government with a responsibility to make sure that all kids have adequate public schools available to them. And because of this, the policymakers have decided that they ought to create new systems apart from the traditional district of delivering public education to kids particularly in need. And so the consequences of this, as I see it, number one, most importantly from my point of view, are we have more low-income families who have power over the educational choices of their kids than ever before, and that is amazing, and that is going to have long-term impacts that are positive. The second one is that this has altered the sense of what we mean by public and public education, which I will get into, which gets into this last point, which is there's a fundamental change in local democratic control. Some of you may call it community voice. They're slightly different probably, but I think they're both important. And it's changing. And this is what gives me the most heartburn about what's happening right now. And so that's why at the end of this all, I'm going to actually end with an ask. We probably disagree about a whole lot, but I'm wondering if there actually might be some common cause on this final point. So I made this a provocative statement at the beginning that I think many leaders think that our urban districts are not doing the job that they need to do. Granted, it's a very extraordinarily difficult task to do a great job of educating all kids in low-income communities, but it's still a task that needs to be done. So rather than just leaving that as an assumption, I want to put forward the data that motivates me and I think motivates some policymakers. And this is NAEP, the nation's report card, the Trial Urban District Assessment. So NAEP is given to states, but for the past 10 years, it's been given to a subset of big urban districts, Trial Urban District Assessments. This is the most recent data, 8th grade reading, which is typically viewed as the best indicator of whether or not kids are going to be able to succeed in high school and beyond. And this is just low-income students because all urban areas, particularly DC, have pockets of high-income areas as well. So this is proficiency for low-income kids in big urban districts, according to the nation's report card. As you can see, they struggle to get more than about 1 in 10 of their low-income kids entering high school prepared to do the kind of work that will lead them to be able to succeed in high school and go on to college and career ready. Now, some people say that there's progress being made in these districts. Same tests, same 8th grade, same low income. And you can see that, yes, technically there is progress being made, but on average it's from 8% proficiency to 11% proficiency. These are the districts that participated in '03 and then again a decade later. Again, we're talking about low-income kids who desperately need an education so they can succeed in life. Even the best of the best, the districts that have won the Broad Prize, the ones that we are told are the shining stars, this is the progress they've made and this is where they currently stand, struggling to get 2 in 10 of their low-income 8th graders prepared to really do high school level work. Based on my background, based on my faith, whatever motivates all of us, this is unjust. We know who these kids are, we know where they live, and this has been going on for entirely too long, and I think that the sense of urgency that comes from this is good. Where this leads us is up for debate, but I would like everyone to look at this and say, this can no longer go on. I just put this up there not to kick sand in anyone's eyes, especially because we're in DC, but I think this is important. Many people have talked about the progress that DCPS has made in the last couple years on NAEP and NAEP TUDA, the state and the district level test, that it outpaced all other districts. This shows of the 21 districts that participate in TUDA, all big urbans, where DCPS currently stands on scale scores in 8th grade reading among low-income kids. You might hear a whole lot about the progress, but what you're not hearing about is DCPS to this day is still the lowest performing urban school district that's tested on this test for low-income kids as they enter high school. We should be up in arms about this, I would say. We should be particularly up in arms because you may not know this, but actually in about a week from now, we are about to have the 50th anniversary of the famous speech that LBJ gave at the University of Michigan commencement, 1964, less than a year after the assassination of JFK, where he actually outlined the pillars of the Great Society, among which one big pillar was America's inner cities and their schools. For half a century, we have been about this business of trying to make this system, the district with its locally elected boards, work better for kids. We have had the strongest backs, the deepest pockets, the best minds on this task. We've had ESEA, we've had Title I, we've had IDEA, we've had state accountability systems, we've had professional development, changes in tenure, changes in evaluation, changes in school grading systems, and on and on and on and on. And that data that you saw is where we are after half a century of work. I mean, it took less than a decade to say we wanted to put a man on the moon before we actually got there. And 50 years later, poor kids in America's cities are not getting the results they deserve. And so this is why I think that there is this sense of urgency among policymakers in particular, who go back to their state constitutions and realize that they, state policymakers, are the one with the responsibility to make sure that public schools are good across the state. Now, there are key clauses in all of your state constitutions along these lines. I know New Jersey because I work there. It was called the thorough and efficient clause. In other places, it might be the adequate and equitable clause. It is a thing that requires of the state government that they do right by kids. This is why, for those of you who may have participated in what are called equity and adequacy lawsuits, when plaintiffs say that a district is not getting enough money for its kids, for its school system, the defendants in those cases are not the districts, they are the state, because the state is constitutionally responsible. They have to pony up the money if the court decides in their favor. What this means is, the big aha, at least for me when I learned this a decade ago, is that districts and school boards are the creatures of state law. They are the ones to whom the state governments have delegated their K-12 responsibility and authority. Let me just repeat this. States are responsible. They create entities, districts, and school boards to deliver on that responsibility. And now they have decided that those districts and urban areas are not doing the job that they want them to do. And that's why this next bullet is so important. That means that state governments can recapture the authority that they have delegated and then reassign it to other places. If you just put yourself in the place of a policymaker who's saying, it is my job to deliver, we created entities, they didn't do it, I have to create some other method to do it. So how do we start to think about this? That is, policymakers are thinking along these lines, but can we actually do public education different than the systems that have been bequeathed us for the past 100 years? And this has been the best way for me to think about it, and I reason by analogy here, so just bear with me. My belief is public education is a set of principles, a set of things that we hold dear that all boys and girls ought to have access to no matter what. And I just put a couple up here that I think give the parameters. We can debate what the actual contours are. Should be available to all kids. You shouldn't have to pay for it. Should be non-discriminatory, prepare you for success throughout life. Add to it as you will. But they are principles that we believe all kids ought to have access to. In the same way, I think democracy is a set of principles. Suffrage for all adults, making sure that everyone gets a vote, no more, no less. Votes are counted fairly. There are private ballots and so forth. Now, this is where it becomes key. We know that in the United States of America, a democratic country, we separately elect our president and our members of Congress. We have separation of powers. Just across the pond, we have the UK, where the prime minister is actually the executive, is a member of the House of Commons, their state legislature. They conflate their bodies of government. Every 4 years when we're thinking about the next presidential elector, we see Iowa in the dead of winter having this strange caucus system. A month later, We see New Hampshire voters go and vote in the primary. The point I'm trying to make here is that no one would argue that Iowa is more or less democratic than New Hampshire or the UK is more or less democratic than the United States. It is that these different institutions have realized that you can bring a set of principles to life in different ways. Let me repeat. You can bring a set of principles to life through different man-made institutions. The problem is in public education, we have for so long conflated the idea of public education with the district. We think these two things are synonymous. In order to have one, we have to have the other. And I'm here to tell you that no, that is actually not the case. That we can preserve public education, these basic principles, without this system that was bequeathed to us. It can go away while we preserve public education. Now, the best line I have ever heard on this comes from Ted Coldery and Joe Graba from Minnesota. I'm a Catholic, so I guess I should hate this, but they use Reformation language. That is, we can preserve the faith while reforming the church. That is, you can hold on to the tenets, you can hold on to your beliefs that remain sacrosanct while you adjust the man-made institutions that were designed to bring them to life. Think about what that means for public education. So what that means is that for a long time, we can think of public education as a space in which different delivery systems can be placed into it. For ages, the dominant one has been the district with its school board. But there are other ones. People have been writing about this for eons. The famous book, Politics, Markets, and America's Schools by Chubb and Moe. Ted Coldery and Paul Hill have been writing about it. I wasted some space in a book that I wrote on this thing. Don't waste your time. A wonderful report from C Trust on Kansas City's takeover or potential takeover did the same thing. People have been writing and thinking about how do you deliver on the promise and the principles of public education absent the district. But it's not just theoretical. We have several examples of different delivery systems that I want to talk about. Mayoral control, state takeovers of districts, the recovery school district model or achievement school district in Tennessee, chartering, and then private schools participating in public programs, which I'll largely put off to the side for the time being. So what I want to just end with are the 6 things that I take away from this that I think are important when we're thinking about the public and public education. The first is, there are baseline public features of all of those different systems in there that we have to be mindful of. For example, all of these public schools have gotten the blessing, the benediction via state law of the state government. They get public funds. There are cases where in all states, public schools have to follow content standards that were adopted by the State Board of Education. They fall under accountability systems and assessments, State Board of Education, State Department of Education. They follow federal and state rules related to discrimination and health and safety, and the list goes on and on and on. I could make the list go longer, but all of this is to say that these schools, although they look different and they could be governed differently, are public in certainly non-trivial ways across the board. Number 2, now I want to just get into these different governance systems where I think you're going to start to see my agreement with Zakiya come out and where I hope that we can start to come to some sort of conclusion about this. So mayoral control, what I will concede about it, well, let me just say this first of all, is it public? Any city that has mayoral control, it has been authorized by state law, meaning a governor and a legislature have embraced it, meaning it has public authority. Second, generally in these cases, it removes the authority of the local school board in almost all cases. I put this in red because this means that there's a loss of local governance, and I'm going to come back to this. I think mayoral control gets around that or mitigates the negative consequences because at least the mayor is locally elected. He is a local official, and he is accountable to the people. So at least we have some semblance of maintenance of local control in the case of mayoral control of urban school districts. Things start to change, though. State takeovers, increasingly popular. Again, in all cases, these are authorized by state law, so at least they have the blessing of the people who we have elected. In the second case, they are overseen in all cases either by the governor or the state chief. So again, they are responsive to public authority. But again, point number 3 here, because the local authority of the board is removed, we do have the loss of local governance, again in this case. Next one, Recovery School District. For those of you who are not familiar, this was created pre-Katrina in Louisiana. An analog was created in Tennessee called the Achievement School District. The idea is the state creates a standalone, separate statewide district, finds the lowest performing schools across the state and takes them one by one and either directly manages them or allows others to manage them. In these cases, once again, authorized by state law, so it is public in this sense, overseen by the state chief, so it does have public oversight. But once again, in the cases where districts are losing control of the schools, we have this red thing that I keep pointing out, loss of local authority over some number of schools. Chartering, next to the last one, as you know, there are state charter laws, has the benediction of state law, overseen by a range of entities. We might want to get into this. I will say delicately that some are more directly, some more indirectly overseen by public entities, and this is an issue that is worth conversation. But for those of you who believe that a public education system ought to have uniform local control, this is an issue for you without any doubt because power is dispersed. You have a range of entities running a range of schools and there is no mother hen telling all of them what to do. For some of you that might not be an issue, but if you actually believe in local uniform democratic control, chartering by its nature may run afoul of your vision of the common good. And last, these private school programs, voucher, tax credit, scholarships. Again, they're passed under state law in the cases where they exist. I put this in yellow, hesitant yellow when it comes to the oversight because even as a voucher, scholarship, tax credit advocate for low-income kids, I think that there is way too little accountability for them. We ought to work on that, but at least there is the semblance of it in some places. But again, going back to the Pierce v. Society of Sisters decision 100 years ago by the Supreme Court, private schools have protections. They're allowed to exist. And so it's awfully tough to actually get into their business. So again, if you were part of the camp that believes there ought to be local control and uniform control, this sixth category, I think, again, would run afoul of your vision of the publicness of a public system. So when I put all this together, my takeaways are as follow. First and foremost, these systems of urban public school systems are changing in profound ways, and these are growing. We are never going to go back, I would say, to an era where a single school system run by a single school board has, in the language of Ted Coldry, exclusive territorial franchise, one entity running all schools in a geographic area. I just can't imagine. I think the genie's out of the bottle on this, and it has implications. Point number two, and I feel passionate about this, and I'll argue with whoever's willing to argue about it, is that these changes were desperately needed. Half a century of low-income kids not getting a fair shake, we had to do something dramatic about it. Point number three, this has led to more choices for families and more family empowerment, which I think is an essential component. Giving families who could never choose their schools that choice has a transformational effect on families and communities, I believe. Number four, as I pointed out, I think these new systems are still public because of the commonalities they have and the fact that they have been blessed by state law and so forth. But it's different because the state government is now the one who's actually exerting the authority here in ways that they haven't in quite some time. And that leads to this sixth and final point, the one that keeps me up at night, the one that I worry the most about. Given that I support those 5 different governance models, from state takeovers to mayoral control to vouchers to chartering, I worry about this one. How do we make sure that in these systems we still have democratic control to some extent, some sort of community voice, where a community can come together and at least have some say on the contours of the system as a whole? And I don't have an answer for it yet, and that's where my ask comes in. So I'm sure lots of you dislike a lot of what I've said, but if you fall into the narrow category of believing in these 3 bullets here, number 1, you want dramatic improvements in K-12 education in America's inner cities. Number 2, if you were open to the idea of a city having multiple school operators, that is, the district can be one, but there are going to be other ones, that there is no longer this territorial exclusive franchise of the district. And if you are willing to believe or open to the hypothesis that elected school boards are not the only way that we can realize democratic voice and democratic control, then I'm looking for thought partners on this, because I think a lot more and better things can be done in New Orleans, hopefully will be done in Memphis, in Camden, and places where a lot of these things are happening, and I want to get to a better answer on this. And so it just comes down to this very simple question. How can we increase local voice and or control in these emerging urban school systems that show no sign of abating anytime soon? So if there are any takers, you can tell me afterwards. Thank you.